Yes.
Great. And it's a great pleasure and an honor, actually. I'd like to introduce Luang Por Sumedho to everybody at the Buddhist Library. Like I said, well, I've never had the pleasure of spending much time with Luang Por. I always have a lot of gratitude in terms of Luang Por's work in spreading Buddhism in the West. Luang Por has been ordained for 50 years, so almost as long as I've been alive, which is pretty impressive. And he's been a very happy, gentle, and a kind monk. Luang Por Sumedho has the great fortune to ordain and live with Ajahn Chah for about 10 years. Luang Por also started many monasteries in the West. Luang Por Sumedho was an abbot of Chinhurst first in Almaty, and lived in England for 34 years. And only until recently, Luang Por has retired in 2010. And like I said, Luang Por started his monastic career in Thailand, and then always had a lot of good memories. And it's now that he's retired, Luang Por is also spending more time in Thailand. And like I said, it's a great pleasure just to have Luang Por here. Hard to know, maybe Luang Por's last trip to the Antipodes, but then again, it could be in a couple years' time. Again, without further ado, I'd like to hand over the mic to Luang Por.
Just as long as everyone can hear me. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namasāmi. So this evening, this is my first time at the Buddhist Library. I never realized there was a Buddhist library in Sydney. And, it's good to see. I was speaking with Tenjo Kunsamai yesterday, and we met years ago when he was in Stanmore, and there wasn't much going on in Sydney. And there was a little house in Melbourne I stayed in, Mary Street. And I've been in Melbourne for about 3 weeks, and just to see the development, interest in Buddhism, in the Thai forest tradition, meditation. This is all very inspiring to see it developing in this way. And I became interested 60 years ago when I was in the Navy, U.S. Navy, and I was on a supply ship from San Francisco to the American bases in Japan. 1955, I had my first encounter with Zen Buddhism, and so that was 60 years ago. And I was 21 years old then, I'm 81. And this interest, it began when I was 21, and I've carried it through to this age. And I've been very fortunate in my life because I met very good teachers and had very good opportunities to meet wise teachers and learn how to practice. The first 10 years were mainly spent reading whatever I could find in English on, mainly it was Zen Buddhism, Japanese type Buddhism. There was D.T. Suzuki's books that were being republished in paperback, and there were Alan Watts' Way of Zen was quite a popular bestseller in the United States in the 1950s, and read anything I could find. In those days, it wasn't easy to find literature on Buddhism in the English language, but now it's no problem. The internet, blogs, Dharma discussion groups, bookshops, everything is readily available. And interest in Buddhism in the West is fairly new. So say 60 years ago, like from the American viewpoint, there was kind of a Zen fashion in the 1950s, like the beat Zen style, and it was an intellectual movement that was particularly concentrated in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it started out as just a kind of intellectual fashion, but many of us began our interest in that from that time. And of course, one is inspired through the intellect, through reading, through listening to talks, but then the actual practice, I wanted to put it into practice. After 10 years of reading, I didn't want to read anymore, I wanted to actually do it. And in those days, I was a graduate student at the University of California in Berkeley, and looking for teachers of meditation in an area where it's very, kind of at the forefront of modern movements. There weren't any. I looked in San Francisco and in Berkeley and anywhere in that area that might produce some kind of meditation teacher. I wasn't particularly concerned what particular form of Buddhism. I ended up going to the Vedanta Society in San Francisco, but I couldn't really sustain an interest in that because I've been infected with the Buddhist virus, and so I'd always return in some way to my interests. And then I volunteered for the Peace Corps in 1963, and they sent me to Sabah and Sarawak, which had just been incorporated into the Federation of Malaysia. So in the beginning of 1964, I went to live in Sabah. And that brought me into the Theravadan world. Before that, I knew hardly anything about Theravada. And because, as I've said before, the main interest was in Zen Buddhism. So living in Sabah, I'd have take holidays. I went to Thailand, Cambodia in 1964 and was very impressed going into Thailand, where, as soon as you enter, you see chedis, stupas, monks on alms round, and beautiful temples everywhere. And then 95% of Thai population are, Theravadan Buddhists. And so I kind of fell in love with Thailand and thought maybe I should investigate the Thai form of Buddhism. And of course the problem then was language, because at that time, this was 50 years ago, over 50 years ago, Thai monks were not educated in the English language. And so it was, one had to, if you were going to live in a Thai monastery, you had to learn the Thai language, which was a challenge. But in my life in Thailand, it was a very blessed kind of life because I did meet Ajahn Chah, who at that time was not known in Bangkok, in the expatriate Buddhist world of Bangkok that I knew, that I was associated with. He was never mentioned as a possibility. He wasn't even known then. And I visited the teachers, famous teachers in Thailand at that time as a layman. I was teaching English in Bangkok, and but nobody ever mentioned Luang Por Chah. And so through a series of coincidences or fate, destiny, karma, or barami, however you want to put it, I did finally, through meeting one of Ajahn Chah's wandering monks, he took me to stay with Luang Por Chah in 1967. And the thing that really I developed was an interest in the basic teaching of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths. And that always impressed me that the Buddha, his first sermon after enlightenment was talking about suffering. When most religions start with metaphysical doctrines about believing in the creator God or an ultimate source. And where in London, for example, they have quite an active interfaith movement, and I used to be quite active in that. And other religions, they had represented all different religions in London at the time, and they all come from a very inspiring place about universal peace and love. And then when they come to me and talk about suffering, and so, we ended up talking mostly about metta, so we weren't so embarrassed, because the Buddha approached the spiritual path in a very different way. And just for example, the metaphysical truths like God and ultimate truth, ultimate reality, or universal love, these are kind of ideals that we believe in or we don't believe in. But they aren't, most people can't relate to that as their experience in the present moment. And so the Buddha, in his first sermon, raised the most unwanted experience that human beings have is suffering. And suffering, of course, is nobody wants it. We want to be happy and secure and safe and successful and wealthy and be healthy. We want the best that we can conceive of with our thinking mind. But suffering we don't want. So why did the Buddha, first sermon to his 5 friends, his 5 colleagues in Sarnath, was there is dukkha, or there is this suffering. And this is the common reality of our lives. Everybody can relate to it. You don't believe in it. You don't have to decide there isn't any suffering, but it's beginning to change your way of looking at it, from seeing that in the highly personal sense, or through the critical mind, through understanding it as you're experiencing it in the present moment. So the emphasis that one sees everywhere in Western countries now is on mindfulness. And for example, in England, that was a word that wasn't all that used in psychology or psychotherapies years ago. And it was more talking about readjusting your personality and and trying to be positive about life. But the mindfulness was not really a part of the psychological terminologies then. Now it's everywhere. Even on the national health, you can have they have opportunities to teach mindfulness courses. Why is that? What is mindfulness about? Is that it's the opportunity we all have to be aware in the present moment. It's not about being mindful tomorrow or remembering yesterday's mindfulness experience, but it's always this here and now, this awakened state, conscious, awakened, and encompassing the moment, not focusing on an object, but on the reality of this moment. This reality is now. And so, usually we're mindful when our lives are in danger. For example, when you drive a car, you have to be mindful because your life is in danger, or you're endangering the life of somebody else. So there's a need to be mindful of where you're driving, who's walking on the street, and the traffic lights and so forth. Or in athletics, or in sports, or rock climbing, mountain climbing, mindfulness is absolutely essential if you're going to survive. But in the safety of a nice home in Sydney, with locked doors and burglar alarms and CCTV cameras, you can have the illusion of safety, physical safety. You're in a country with a stable government, good economy. You're not expecting a revolution or anything like in various parts of the world right now. There's no safety anywhere. But here in Australia, we can go back to our homes, lock the door, and become completely obsessed with fears and resentments and anger, bitterness about things of the past, or worries, fearing the future. What might happen in the future? Will I get the prize? Will I be successful? Will I be able to pay the rent? And mental states like this arise in the mind even in the most safe, stable, external conditions. And these are the problems of modern life. Why suddenly is there this interest in mindfulness and in meditation in countries like this that before showed no interest whatsoever in Buddhism? And of course, Buddhism is at the forefront of this. You can teach mindfulness without using Buddhist terminology. But actually, the Buddhist teaching, the Four Noble Truths, is about cultivating mindfulness. In order to understand suffering, you have to receive it, you have to feel it, you have to experience suffering, not just react to it with aversion or distracting yourself or blaming it on somebody else. So the sense of the personalities we have, the cultural conditions that we're conditioned by, our cultural backgrounds, our ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, convey a sense of dis-ease, like there's something we have to get that we don't have. We're imperfect the way we are, we have to do something, and in order to get something we don't have to become better, we've got to get rid of bad thoughts, anger, jealousy, fear, and all this comes from the sense of a separate self. because as separate individuals, we're quite vulnerable as human forms. We're not tough animals. We're easily damaged just physically as well as emotionally, mentally. So we can become totally obsessed and insane in the safest, most ideal external conditions. Because of what? Because of the way we're thinking, the conditioning of our personality, the cultural background that we're from the thinking process itself. And so the Buddha directed his attention to suffering as a noble truth. And so it's taking what most of us, or maybe all of us, don't want, the nasty fact of life, and placing it in this category of his first sermon after enlightenment, calling it the first noble truth. And this is a very interesting thing to be doing, because sometimes you think, what's noble and true about suffering? Is something, that modern life is where every effort is to find happiness and security. But it's like learning to change your attitude from seeing suffering with aversion, with wanting to get rid of it, blaming it on institutions, on parents, on husband, wife, neighbors, or whatever, to understanding it. To understand something, you have to accept it for what it is. If you're always reacting with aversion and fear and distraction, then of course you'll never understand suffering. You're just conditioned to react to it. So when you feel insecure, worried, anxious, angry, or whatever the condition, emotional condition might be, suffering then is something we are trying to get rid of, rather than seeing it in terms of a noble truth, the first noble truth. So this is changing from just the conditioned personality that's conditioned out of ignorance of Dhamma, not being awake, not understanding ultimate reality, not understanding Dhamma, to becoming one who's understanding, looking at suffering, because it's something that we can all easily relate to. It's not something that some people experience and others don't. So whether you're wealthy or poor or male or female or whatever race, religion, social position, suffering is pretty much the same thing. Whether it's ancient India, time of the Lord Buddha, or modern Australia, modern Sydney, suffering is not about suffering in India, but about suffering here and now. This sense of dis-ease, restlessness, self-disparagement, fears, irrational fears, worries about the future, guilt, remorse, and resentments of the past haunt the human mind, even in affluent societies such as this one. So, actually, when the Buddha was enlightened, according to the suttas, the scriptures, he thought to himself, how can you teach Dhamma? How can you teach reality? Like Dhamma is reality. How can you teach that? It's beyond words. Dhamma has no form. You can't hold it in your hand and say, this is Dhamma. You can't define it or or describe it. But you can know it, because that's what you really are. When you're mindful, then your mindfulness with wisdom, then of course one is in that position of knowing from this ultimate state of universal conscious knowing, rather than just personal definitions and the sense of the isolated sense of separateness that we have through our identity with our separate forms, our views, opinions, our cultural conditioning, personalities we're all different on that level. But at this moment, when we reflect that consciousness isn't about something, it's not culturally conditioned, it's not personal, it's not limited to the form, to the body. Even though in Western psychology they tend to see consciousness as inside the body, actually the body is in consciousness. And so mindfulness then is our ability to begin to recognize that, the reality of consciousness, where the body is in consciousness rather than consciousness, assume that consciousness is inside your body, inside your brain or your head. Because that makes no sense. If consciousness is just trapped within the human form, then there's not much hope. We're establishing these definitions of separateness and believing that's ultimately real. But when we begin to reflect on consciousness as unlimited, deathless reality, as Dhamma, then of course it's different. Suddenly we're unified in consciousness. At this very moment, when we're mindful, then there's a unity it's the same consciousness, whether it's me or you or the mosquito or the dog or the bird. And suddenly you feel a connection with the whole of nature and the planet, because you belong to the whole of it, rather than this isolated sense of the separateness of a physical body, your own personal views, opinions, your cultural identities, social identities. All are about divisions and separations, about higher, lower, better, worse, good and bad, right and wrong. So this evening, just to present this, I'm not asking you to believe me, but just presenting which I find a more useful way of looking at life than just from the personal, separate view of me as this Buddhist monk, Ajahn Sumedho, as something separate from the, and operating always from the self view. Now, in the 50 years that I've been able to practice with this, because I've been doing this now. Actually, I started when I was a samanera, before I met Luang Por Sumedho. I fled Bangkok because I became so confused by the views and opinions of the expatriate Buddhists that I'd meet. They were all telling me, this teacher is the best, or that one isn't any good, it's this teacher. And there were so many views, and everyone was so absolutely sure that their view was the right one. And all I could find was total confusion in my mind. And so I fled Bangkok, disappeared and ordained as a samanera in Nong Khai, which is northwest Thailand, the the province you go to cross into Laos, when you go to Vientiane in Laos. So I spent a year as a novice monk in Nong Khai, and it was one of these meditation monasteries where you enter a kuti. They gave me a kuti in the forest and told me I could do walking meditation, sitting meditation, but I couldn't go anywhere else. I had to stay 24 hours a day and meditate. And I stayed there for a year. And this was nearly a year. And this, the first 3 months was very difficult because the first 3 days I enjoyed very much being alone, being without the social pressures, and that they bring me some food every day. And the monks, the nuns there at this Wat Nun Panau were very, were trying to support me. So, but I couldn't speak the language. Nobody could speak English in this monastery. I didn't have a teacher. Just by myself with one book, one small kind of pamphlet called The Word of the Buddha, which was published in Sri Lanka, the Buddhist Publication Society. And it was a compilation of the basic teachings of the Buddha from the scriptures. So the scripture, the Tripitaka, is very big. I didn't want to take that with me into this kuti. I thought it's too much to handle, all the volumes of the Tripitaka. But this book, Word of the Buddha, thin little pamphlet really, compiled by German bhikkhu in Sri Lanka, Ñāṇatiloka. So the first 3 months was nothing but suffering actually. It was, what happens when you're alone like that and you don't have distractions? You're brought the food, so you don't have a fridge, you can't nibble on biscuits or anything. Everything was very basic. This was at this time very primitive place. No electricity, no radios, no internet, no Wi-Fi. These things were beyond imagination in those days. But what are you supposed to do? I tried doing just concentration practices, just like the concentrating on the breath and trying to suppress emotions. So that I wanted, I had this ambition to attain jhanas, high levels of concentration. And I wanted the bliss that I imagined you could have from concentrating the mind and shutting everything else away from it. But I couldn't actually do that because I was, I think, 31 years old at the time. And I'm from a family in the United States where we were never allowed to show anger. So I had 31 years of suppressed anger coming up. And it wasn't at anything in the monastery. I couldn't blame the anger on the monks or the mechis or the people around. It was coming from, as I tried to hold it back and concentrate the mind, it became even stronger. And finally, there was nothing left to do but just sit with it. And somehow I had the insight to just not try to control it. And so I remember it was about 3 months of this unmitigated resentment, anger, bad thoughts, things that emotions that had been suppressed in life suddenly were arising in consciousness, were becoming conscious. And then I had the insight into you just had to let them go. You couldn't, with every attempt to try to suppress and control it, I couldn't do it. I could do it for a while, but I couldn't sustain it. If I had a more busy life with distractions, I could develop a lifestyle. But in solitary confinement like that, there's nothing much you can distract yourself with, except reading this book, The Four Noble Truths. And so I deliberately took only this one pamphlet, The Word of the Buddha, and so that I didn't have anything else to read. Because I used to be a bookworm. I used to always have a book with me. And every time I started feeling insecure, I'd bring out my book. But in this situation, all I had was this one book, which didn't take long to read through. But I began to contemplate, the noble truths as I was experiencing. And the insight into letting go became apparent, that I had the only way to deal with repressed anger, fear, jealousy, these primal emotions that human beings have, that everyone has, is not through trying to suppress or control, but understanding them. They arise, and then what arises in consciousness is actually, if you allow it, it'll cease. It goes away. It's not where suppressing, trying to control it, is you're actually holding back. You're making more kind of karmic connections to anger, resentment, through fear, through aversion, through trying to prevent it. So the result of this, after 3 months, was I woke up one morning in this kuti, which is just a basic kind of wooden structure with a tin roof, and everything looked beautiful, luminous. And this kuti was not beautiful, but it looked, everything, the forest around me, even went to the toilet, which was never considered beautiful, and it looked wonderful. And I thought, this is very strange. I tried to think a bad thought or arouse anger. I couldn't. There was it just wouldn't grab hold. And so I thought, this must be enlightenment. I'm already enlightened, because I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know what I was doing. Actually, it was more or less trial and error and just learning as you go along. So I had this state. I stayed in this state for about 5-6 days to a week. Then I had to go into the town of Nong Khai to the immigration, because my visa, you don't get long stays in Thailand, and so I had to renew the visa. And they had an immigration office in Nong Khai, and so I went there, and I remember going in the immigration office, and there was this hostility towards me. I felt these people in the immigration service didn't want to help me, because actually they weren't supposed to renew visas for foreigners. We were supposed to go to Bangkok and do it in the main immigration service there. But the head monk of the province had arranged for them in some way. And they obviously resented it, because they were very unwilling, but they did it. They eventually stamped my visa, but I felt this aversion, and this whole luminous state of enlightenment just crashed. Like a big iron wall coming right down in front of you. And I went back to the monastery, and I kept trying to get this state back. You know, I kept thinking, I want that again. I want to be like that all the time. Because what I lacked was this state, was a natural state of consciousness. But I didn't know what it was at the time. I didn't have wisdom. I wasn't informed with wisdom at all. I just had this rather marvelous experience of reality without wisdom. So then, of course, it would be like, well, I'm enlightened, and that, in the sense that I'd never, I was coming from the ego, that I am Por Sumedho, am enlightened. Well, maybe I'm the first American arahant. The ego's like that. And then, after that, I stayed on in this monastery and just reflected on these Four Noble Truths. And during this time, I met a disciple of Ajahn Chah, who was what they call a Tudanga bhikkhu. They're wandering, keeping the Tudanga rules in the Vinaya. And he could speak English. He was the same age as I. He was in the Thai Navy during the Korean War. I was in the American Navy, and he could speak fluent English. So I hadn't been able to speak English to anybody for about a year, and so I couldn't tell what had happened to me. I didn't have anyone to confide in, and I couldn't speak the Thai or the dialect they spoke in Nong Khai. So I remember just starting to speak English, and it was just like a dam bursting. I couldn't stop. I thought, this monk must think I'm mad. I'm crazy. But he's the one that told me about Ajahn Chah. And I kind of realized I needed training. I couldn't just stay in a kuti, in a meditation hut the rest of my life. And I did have insights into these noble truths through reading in this book, The Word of the Buddha. But I realized I needed to be under a teacher. I needed to learn how to live within the restraint of the Vinaya. These were things I became kind of intuitively aware. I needed structures to live my life, and if I just operated on my own, my old habits would come flowing back. So I went with this. I took the higher ordination in 1967 and went with this monk to stay with Ajahn Chah. And of course there, in Wat Pah Pong, the style of life was based on mindfulness. It was learning how to surrender to this form. And it's not easy for an American from California to surrender to moral restraints and different cultural conditions. Americans were brought up to be arrogant, thinking we know best. And then suddenly I had to learn how to bow and how to pay respect in my place within the structure. But Luang Por Cha was always, he was never telling me what to think, but always encouraging me to observe what I'm feeling in regards to the life that I was living. Because the first year was very confusing, because you had to learn another language, learn how to live within in a society that was very different from the one that I was used to. Learn to live within monastic forms and structures, and so everything was new. A different type of food that I didn't like at first, and everything was, frustrating for me. And when you're living in a place where they speak another language and you don't know that language, you do feel, you get very frustrated and restless and paranoid. I get paranoid, and what are they talking about? And then I was the first Western monk there, so people just come and stare at me. Why are they looking at me like that? Bring up fears and paranoid mental states. But the Ajahn Chah was his kind of brilliant way of teaching was where we didn't have a common language to converse in, was pointing, and he was getting me to look at what I'm actually feeling, and seeing it in terms of Dhamma, of all conditions are impermanent. So this is what the Buddha actually realized in enlightenment, when he was enlightened, was this simple reality of sabbe sankhara anicca, all conditions are impermanent. And this, of course, makes it very easy for us, because the conditioned realm is everything, absolutely everything. And how do we relate to conditioned realities, to the changing forms of just physical forms, or sensual experiences through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, through feeling, through emotion? How do we relate to that? Is that we're conscious with mindfulness, with wisdom, knowing. And what is common to all conditions is that they are impermanent. Whatever is born dies, whatever arises ceases. And one can agree with that intellectually, but the actual development of the path of liberation is actually observing it. Because we have to live our lives within changing forms. So with the aging process of our own bodies, how the weather affects us, the conditions around us, the people we live in, the things that we do, what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch. Everything is all conditions are impermanent. And this knowing of impermanence then is wisdom with consciousness, knowing that, observing, witnessing, recognizing all conditions are impermanent. And then the emphasis was pointing here. They usually point to the heart. Like they say, the Luang Por Chah would point here and say, the world ends here, and he'd point to his heart. He wasn't pointing at himself. But the direction was you had to observe, really pay attention to what you're feeling. So in the first year, the frustration of feeling was, a lot of them were very negative, because you feel, I had this Ajahn Chah was 48 years old when I first met him, and he was at his peak. He could give sermons 5 hours, for 5 hours, and every evening after the evening puja, he'd get up on the high seat. They have this high seat they sit on, and he'd start giving Dharma talks, which would last sometimes 5 hours. And I was expected to sit through these Dharma talks, which I couldn't understand. And all the other monks were enjoying it, at least they seemed to. And there were a lot of lay people, from the villages around the town would come almost every evening to listen to Luang Por Sumedho expound Dhamma. And Luang Por Sumedho had a great sense of humor, so he was a charismatic personality, a very charming person in his own right. And he obviously had insight, he obviously knew what he was talking about. And he was talking about the Four Noble Truths, and all conditions are impermanent. But in the Northeast dialect, in Newborn Lao dialect, which was even more difficult to comprehend than Bangkok Thai. So I remember going up one evening and suggesting to him, since I don't understand the language, I think I'd benefit more if I return to my kuti and practice samadhi when you give your talks. Then I think I'd develop more, get better samadhi, because I don't understand anything you're saying. and I conveyed this to him, and he said, no, you have to stay. He said, you have to develop patience. And I thought, this is really unfair. Very negative. But I did. I did respect him enough to obey. And I knew I lacked patience. This was not one of my virtues as a personality. Patience was not highly developed in my background. So I had every opportunity to develop patience with Luang Por Sumedho. But the aim is to observe this restless feeling, this aversion. Sometimes, I remember one evening, I was just so fed up, because you had to sit in this very formal style, papia, which in Thailand is very polite. When you listen to a monk giving desana, giving a Dharma talk, you have to sit with one leg to the side. This is very painful for someone who never sat like that. And I practiced yoga before, so I could sit in full lotus posture, actually. But I couldn't, but sitting for just 10 minutes and papia with one leg to the side was excruciating. And just feeling this physical pain and this restlessness and this thinking, this is not fair, and I'm wasting my time, and I've had enough, I'm fed up. And then suddenly I realized that I think I can't endure any more of this, and then suddenly I realized I am enduring. This is what endurance is about. The mind, my emotions say I can't stand it anymore, but I could. Became aware I could stand it. And it was quite an insight, just through reflecting and listening to my own emotional reactions, as they become conscious, and the limitation that would place on me, because if I believed that I couldn't stand it, then I wouldn't be able to stay. So it's like this this life of Buddhist monk, as I trained with Luang Por in Uborn, began to, as I began to understand the language and I began to settle into the life, the body adjusted to sitting with one leg to the side. I learned how to eat the food and live the life. I became much more kind of content with monastic life, and that was the point of this learning to be content with little, because like Buddhist monks were alms mendicants. We're dependent on the kindness of the lay community. Now this is going against all my American values, because I was brought up in a kind of middle-class Christian background where you're supposed to be self-sufficient. You know, you got to look after yourself first because nobody else will care. And it's very cynical when you think of it, you know, how my attitude towards society, towards other people was that they won't care. You know, I have to really make sure that I survive. Where when I suddenly realized the kind of commitment I'd made as taking the bhikkhu training, I became quite shocked. You know, I'm dependent even on food. I can't even, you know, go to the supermarket and buy food or grow cabbages in the back garden. I've got to depend on people offering food every day, and I think this is going against the kind of cultural conditioning of my generation of Americans. And so I've lived for the past 50 years on alms food, and so it's never been a problem. You know, it's quite brilliant how the Buddha established his first sermon, and then this is a brilliant paradigm to use for life, to investigate, but you have to apply it here. You know, it's not just reading it in the Tripitaka, but in making it work for you. So you're looking and you're learning to understand, learning to let go, learning to understand the nature of consciousness and your own conditioning, you know, your cultural biases, your social attitudes, your personal, your ego, how that operates. So it's not it's this wisdom that the Buddha is pointing at isn't about discrimination. It's not about one thing being better than the other. The thinking mind is discriminatory. Like when you think, then if you've got good, then there's better, and there's best, and there's bad, worst. There's levels of quality, size, color, shape. These are all about the conditioned realm, the things we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, think, and feel. But mindfulness is where we connect to a universal consciousness, putting it in this way. It's the gate or the door to the deathless, ultimate reality. And then from there, we discern the real from the delusion, from illusion. So wisdom isn't about judgments or preferring one thing over another. It's observing, discerning, ultimate reality, knowing. The consciousness can know itself. You know, you can't define or know consciousness as an object, but you are conscious at this moment, and you know it. It's like this. and it's not, and then you might think or feel these things are changing. Your thoughts, your memories come and go, your emotions change, and the physical conditions change. But it's just this simple recognition of knowing from this position of mindfulness, awareness. Sati in Pali they use sati, sampajanya, and panya, which is mindfulness. Sampajanya is like intuitive awareness or apprehension. It's this complete. It's an open attention, not focused on an object. And then panya, discernment. And panya is not cultural. It's not personal. It's not. It's not even Buddhist. But it's certainly available to us when we open ourselves to ultimate reality. So this is opportunity to investigate. What you think you are, what you believe you are, is conditioned. And so, it's not saying it's wrong or right, but we're noticing that whatever you believe is a condition that you create with thoughts, with memories, with cultural biases, prejudices, assumptions that we make about ourselves and the world, the society we live in. And the Buddha, this teaching of the Four Noble Truths, if you carry it through, it gives you, for each truth there's three aspects. And these aspects then are the statement, like the first noble truth, the statement is from the scripture, there is suffering. It's just an intellectual statement that you can read in the scripture, and then it tells you what to do. Suffering should be understood. So the second aspect is what to do about suffering. What do I do? Suffering. There is suffering. It should be understood. Then to understand, as I said before, to understand something, you have to accept it for what it is. If you're always resisting and reacting to it, you'll never understand suffering. So and this is a shift from someone who's trying to find happiness to this noble state of knowing suffering is like this. It's an insight. The third aspect is the insight. Suffering has been understood. And these insights they come from patibhata, from practice, not from just believing scriptural teachings. The second noble truth is the cause of suffering, the origin of suffering. Suffering is not ultimate reality. It's not a metaphysical reality. It's a noble truth. So in terms of other religions, they start from the top, from I believe in God, which is either you believe or you don't believe. But believing is through thinking. You either accept what somebody tells you about God or you object to it. Those are the reactions to theistic approaches. And then where the Buddha didn't start from the top, from the ultimate, but from the here and now, there is suffering, taking the most banal, common human experience that everyone can relate to. can observe. So it's not special. It's not. Some people can do it and others can't. It's part of our life itself, and it's changing from reacting blindly out of ignorance of Dhamma to understanding. And then then the second noble truth is there's an origin. Suffering has a beginning and an ending, and it's not, so it's being aware of the beginning and ending of suffering. Second and third noble truth is the origin of suffering is due to ignorance of Dhamma, not knowing Dhamma, not being mindful. We attach to desires. So they list 3 desires. Kama Tanha, which is the desire for sense pleasures, which is quite obvious. Bhava Tanha, the desire for becoming, it's like ambition, desire to become enlightened is Bhava Tanha. Desire to get something you don't have yet, and then there's Vibhava, the desire to get rid of. Like, how do I get rid of anger and fear? And these are common questions you get from meditators on retreats. I have a anger problem and I want to get rid of it. That's Vibhava. And so you're pointing out that Tanha is a condition, it arises and ceases, it's not permanent. And that which knows Tanha, this mindfulness, is aware of Tanha, and these 3 categories are very helpful. And in a religious practice, because much of religion tends to bring up Bhava Tanha, wanting to become enlightened, wanting to become perfect, wanting to attain and achieve the best. They're very good desires, they're very altruistic desires. Desire to get rid of anger is, I don't want to be an angry person, I want to be a loving, helpful person. How do I get rid of anger? How do I get rid of fear? How do I get rid of jealousy? Where you're changing notice the change, you're not about getting rid of, but you're aware of the desire to get rid of, and the desire to attain, and you imagine enlightenment is something you've got to get in the future, some ideal state of bliss that is very appealing, that you desire. You can be aware of these desires. And as I said, awareness isn't judging. It's not saying you shouldn't have any desires, but it's using the desires you do have with wisdom, seeing that their nature is impermanent. Sape sankhara anicca, all conditions are impermanent. So that leads to the insight into letting go of desire. The second aspect of the second noble truth is to let go. And letting go is like to put down, it's not to throw away or destroy. Like desire out of ignorance of Dhamma, and then the grasping of that desire the grasping is the problem, not the desire. The grasping that we do out of habit, out of fear, out of just habit of trying to get something or get rid of something, never investigating, not recognizing what we're doing, but just following habit patterns and ideals that we might hold to when we don't know what we're doing. So the insight to let go is to put down. Pahahana, which is like to lay down, is not to throw away or destroy. So it's learning to relax, in other words. To see meditation as as relaxation rather than as attainment-oriented, goal-oriented kind of practice. Because so many people, in my experience, approach meditation with a desire to get something, so that if you notice, you contract with bhava-tanha, and when you're trying to attain and get something and control, you tend to contract the body. You feel this tension, and then the inside letting go is more like relaxing. So the attitude of mindfulness is relaxed attention, not attention like on command, like a military command. Attention, then you go like this. Say relax. And so the attitude of letting go you have that insight through this reflection on the Second Noble Truth. And you develop this sense of, you began to see the suffering. I began to notice the suffering I create through my grasping. Just observing the desire and grasping, and as I was doing it, and then the insight is letting go of it and relaxing. And then that made meditation into something quite pleasant, rather than just trying to get your samadhi and get rid of your defilements. It's something much more peaceful and enjoyable. Like once I asked Luang Por Sumedho about meditation, he said he defined it as holiday of the heart. In Thai, it's Pakpon Tang Jitjai. And I thought, that's not what I'm doing. To me, meditation's hard work, And so I thought, the holiday of the heart, I've got to hold that one up, because my tendency is to, from my personality, my cultural background is to control and attain and trying to get rid of bad things and hold on to the good. So then this leads to, letting go leads to cessation, nirodha. And nirodha is where the actual, you're aware of the absence of desire, non-desire. There's awareness and wisdom noticing non-desires like this. And non-desire isn't, you can't claim it as a personal attainment. It's reality itself. And the discerning, grasping is like this, letting go is like this, desire is like this, non-desire is like this. The non-desire then leads to right understanding of the Fourth Noble Truth, Sammaditthi, which is the development of the Eightfold Path, or the path of non-suffering. So I'll stop here. I've covered a lot in a brief time. But the main point is to encourage you all in this development of mindfulness, and my respect for the Buddhist path is 100%, because it's actually worked for me. It's not something that I regret in any way. It is a rich opportunity in one's life to understand yourself and the world you live in a way that deals with our own tendencies towards fear and worry and greed and social problems, personal problems are all created out of the thinking mind, out of ignorance, and so we begin to see through our own tendencies towards creating neurotic fears and desires. So I can open the time for questions and answers.
John, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming to Australia. Before I ask my question,
where are you?
Here, sir. Before I ask my question, John Barter, ex-Javano, asked to pass on his regards. He had to fly north earlier, so he hopes to see you in Queensland. In your book, Now is the Knowing, you said that when we observe that attachment to beauty, sensual pleasures, and love will always lead to despair, can you say something about love? Because with the metta practice, perhaps love has lost its meaning in the present day, but I foresee in my practice that I want to show loving kindness to everybody I meet on a daily basis. And I was quite surprised by your use of the word love there.
Well, the English word love is used for in so many different contexts. It can mean just liking something, but in like unconditioned love, like in Christian definition, metta is that, Actually, love is what holds everything together. Love is Dhamma. You notice how anger, hatred separates, divides everything. Criticism, this is better than that, and then you're always dividing everything into right and wrong, good or bad. But metta is not judgmental. It's not about, when you're in the formulas, Pali formulas for spreading metta, it's to, all beings, whether the devil himself, so it's not about the angels get more metta than the devil. And it's not about, I'm spreading metta to all my friends, but the rest I don't care about. It's about unconditioned acceptance of life and conditioned phenomena, which doesn't mean approval. It's not in that discriminating of approving or liking, but recognizing. So actually, it's just how I would define love now in terms of metta is it's the very basis of life. And that's what, the kindness, like I've experienced in monastic life, the generosity, where I said before, I was cynical about it. You have to look after yourself, nobody else will care. And before I went to live in England, I became concerned about how I was going to survive in a non-Buddhist country, keeping the Vinaya, and without money and keeping the Vinaya in the style of Watpapong, where in Thailand you can take a lot for granted because most of the people are Buddhist. But in England I didn't know what to expect. And so I went to Ajahn Chah one evening and told him my worries. I said, I don't really know if I can do this because there aren't that many Buddhists, and I've never lived in London. I know just one or two people. and I can't expect them to feed me every day. And so he said, "Are there?" Then he replied, "Are there good people in England?" And I said, "Oh yes, I'm sure there are." And we'll go, you know. And suddenly I realized he had this understanding of human nature as basically good, loving, and I was an idealistic American, but was cynical. I had this sense that wasn't the case, that you had to think of yourself first. And my experience in 34 years living there, never went without food. In fact, I gained a lot of weight there. Used to be very slim. No, and the other, you know, we had a very good life in England, and because it's very tolerant society towards religion, and so I never felt diminished or persecuted as a Buddhist monk there. I found you know, people were quite respectful. People generally, Buddhism has a good public image in a country like that. But metta isn't sentimental or liking, but it's what do you say, like accepting things the way they are, even if you don't like it. Then like suffering, accepting it for what it is understanding it. And from there you learn from it to let go of the causes of suffering. You know, it's not about control or annihilation or picking and choosing, but understanding with wisdom.
Can you say a little bit more about thinking with the heart?
No, please.
Thinking with the heart.
Like thinking is a very good question. Thinking with the heart. And of course, thinking is a habit. You know, so you like a newborn baby isn't thinking, doesn't have a language yet. So you learn to think. But consciousness is, you know, like newborn babies, fully conscious. And it has, you know, survival intelligence. It knows what it needs, you know, for survival. And so, you know, it's a human form with consciousness, but it's not a personality yet. It doesn't see itself as Australian or Thai or anything, or boy or girl. That kind of information you get from your mother, usually, or father. And then, so this just to notice, like an infant, it learns a language, and then thinking becomes like we have proliferating thoughts, or one thought goes on to another. You learn you know, your basic language, first language, and that becomes your habit pattern of interpreting life through the thinking process. But with mindfulness and wisdom, you realize that thinking is very limited. It's good for discriminating, for comparing conditioned phenomena. So this is bigger and this is smaller, and then you know you have that's about size, shape, color, quality, and that's what the thinking process discriminates with. Then we have cultural biases, so you're brought up in a social identity or ethnic, cultural background or religious conditioning conditions you to see things in a certain way through certain perceptions that you acquire, that you're not born with. But with mindfulness, you're actually going back to your true nature, consciousness, before you were born, before you started thinking and identifying with the body or your cultural identity or personality. There's consciousness, and then with consciousness with wisdom is like I say, then our thinking process comes from wisdom rather than from habit patterns or prejudices or personal taste.
Or competitiveness, maybe.
Compassion arises through mindfulness. It's how we relate to the sadness of the world. It's not created out of sentimentality or feeling sorry for others. So it's not. It isn't from the ego, but it's like an enlightened individual, and compassion is how that being relates to the sadness that we witness in our families or the society itself. And mudita is joy, and that rises from the beauty, the goodness in the world around us, in the goodness of others, and the beauty of nature. There's a lot of this sense of joy that arises from what we see or hear through the senses, and that we relate to the beauty and goodness of life with joy rather than critical mind. And then upekkha is equanimity, which is the nature of just pure awareness, the equanimous upekkha. And these are the divine abodes, or in structure of Buddhism, Buddhist teaching, and they're called divine abodes or Brahma Viharas, but they're spontaneous, like metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha. They're not created states that we come out of thinking good thoughts. They're spontaneous.
In your book, Intuitive Awareness, you talk about two types of critical people, and so one of the critical person types described as the anger aversion type, and they have a tendency towards very structured meditations. And then the other type of person you describe is someone, the type that is lustful and greedy, and they tend to lean towards the metta, loving kindness meditation. I've been thinking about this.
I can't hear. I'm hard of hearing. So,
you describe two types of characters. One is the anger character, who are inclined towards structured meditation, and the greed person who's drawn towards the metta meditation.
Yes, yeah. The two critical types of people and the different meditations that they're drawn to. And I've been really, reflecting and thinking about that. And in my mind, it just seems to go the other way for those times. So I just wonder if you could just clarify how you arrived at, your observation of, the two critical types and the meditations that they lean towards.
Well, now I'd be more inclined to not say you're the greedy kind or the critical kind, but encourage people to just be aware of it. Because it doesn't help to say, oh, your problem is with anger. I mean, because I found that, not a very skillful way to talk. Because people are so willing to believe me. And it just confirms maybe their worst fears, that they've got to get rid of anger rather than be aware of it. Or greed is the same thing. Encouraging metta practice is skillful for everybody, but because it is a way of, it's very reflective toward anger and resentment, toward the critical mind, because we know so many things shouldn't be, and it's not fair, and there's so many things to criticize in oneself or in the world we live in. And it's right, that things should be fair, and people should be kind, and we should stop war. I agree. But actually it's like this, beginning to realize that just thinking about how things should be creates suffering. So then we begin to let go of the causes of suffering, other than trying to complain about the fact that life isn't what it should be. And people, like some people are, like I've seen, in my own experience, I'm a skeptical type mind. I found it very difficult to believe in what people tell me. And so I was brought up as a Christian, a very nice form of Christianity, Anglican, High Church Anglican, and it was, I quite liked it. It wasn't a unpleasant upbringing, but when I started questioning the beliefs, the creed, I found I couldn't believe it. And you learn to say the creed when you're a child, and you believe what your mother tells you or what the priest says, and there's no problem. When you get into adolescence, then you start questioning, And I remember one day saying that I believe in God, the Father Almighty, and I suddenly realized I didn't know what I was saying. What is that? and I could say it. I could still repeat the Nicene Creed for you if you want. And something that you don't forget. But then going to my mother and asking her, and she said, "Don't doubt. Doubt is a sin." And then I went to the priest, and he said the same thing. And so I tried to not doubt, and then create more doubt. That's why I became a Buddhist. And then I found out in this type of mindfulness practice that I've been pointing to this evening, doubting is a technique, like in Zen Buddhism, they've got these koans where these impossible conundrums that you intellectually you can't come to a conclusion, but you begin to notice the not knowing state of mind, the bewildered state of mind, the doubting reality of the present where thinking stops. And so, like, I've developed a lot of meditation on doubt, so just not knowing, and I found this very useful for me with the character, the kind of karmic tendency character I have, where my sister is a devout Roman Catholic now, and she doesn't doubt, she just believes, and she doesn't have any problem with that. And so she's quite happy with that, so one doesn't begrudge her that, but I couldn't do it, it's just impossible. Well, there's a difference between, we're from the same mother. But she's quite sympathetic with what I'm doing. She's not a narrow-minded person.
One more question.
Well, this decade, 2020, is International Decade on Biodiversity Conservation. Is the focus living in harmony with nature? And of course, it's supported with all the efforts to alleviate climate change and to alleviate extinction of the species. So please share it with us. How do you connect the teaching of the Dharma and your insights with living in harmony with nature in your life? And how do you encourage others to do that? Because in the West, certainly my dukkha, it's almost insignificant compared to what I see, in the world and what others are experiencing.
Yes, well, one thing is that mindfulness is nature itself, connects you to ultimate, to reality itself, and that can only, we can't make others do it, I can't. If I had a magic wand I could enlighten everyone, I'd do it. Not that I don't want to, but I can't. And so you point to the way to awaken and to treasure this ability that each one of us has to awaken to ultimate, to Dhamma, to reality itself. And then you feel a connection, a oneness with all of nature, rather than just like trees and mountains and things are there, as separate, totally separate things. That's how we can exploit nature, because we see it as there for us to use, and we don't respect it, because we see how to make money out of it and exploiting nature for money, for our own benefit. That comes through ignorance, through not understanding Dhamma. So I see the emphasis that now on mindfulness is a good sign because it's not just one or two people. It's spreading, and it's what we lack in our own culture. Is wisdom, universal wisdom. We're clever. We can manipulate the conditioned realm to what we want to get and distract ourselves or enjoy through the senses, and we're very clever in that, in manipulating conditioned phenomena. But it's not, you can see it's leading us towards destruction, towards annihilation. Where mindfulness is not, it leads towards understanding, respect, compassion. How resolve the differences, is not through making everybody believe and conform to the same thing, but awakening them to reality itself. Because that's possible. That's not just, modern society. Or modern psychological discovery, ancient teaching. But don't despair.
I don't despair.
Okay.
I did in past and got depressed, so I have to let go.
Okay. So I think that's the end for today. Thank you everyone for being here, and especially